All right. Welcome, everyone, and good morning to you on this Thursday morning. Thank you so much for joining us for this event, this final event in our series, Finding Your Place in Climate Solutions. Though you can't see each other, please know that today you're in the company of an impressive group of Davidson alumni, friends, community partners, students, and faculty who are already active in climate work. And I know that we'll all learn a great deal from our panelists in today's conversation. Thanks so much to these panelists and our moderator, Dr. Ken Menkhaus, for sharing their experiences and expertise with us today. Also to Adam and Carissa, who I don't think you can see, but they're running the tech side of things. Behind the curtain here, my colleague Cameron Clark, who is set up in Hans Auditorium on campus right now, supporting the in-person viewing experience for students, and to the Sustainability Office student employees who helped with a number of aspects of launching this event series this winter. Finally, I want to give a special shout out to my sister, who I see not often enough, but was able to join from Alabama today. So hi, Jordan. The Finding Your Place in Climate Solutions series seeks to support, highlight, and bridge the large and growing network of Davidson College affiliated individuals active in the climate space. We launched the series last winter in 2023, and it's great to see so many of you joining us again in this cycle. We aspire to a variety of topics and formats, so please reach out if you have ideas for future events or speakers. This work that we're doing together, this shared work, is serious and urgent, of course. But I hope that we can all take hope in the many talented folks of all generations who are rolling up their sleeves. In this year's series, we partnered with the Office of Education Abroad for a delicious Indian meal and roundtable dialogues, where students who recently returned from abroad shared reflections on climate and sustainability from their travels with one another and with students who are preparing to go abroad. Earlier this week, in partnership with the Matthews Center, students from across class years and majors joined a career chat with Energy United's CEO to explore energy industry pathways, both for scientists and future engineers, as well as for those with social science and humanities backgrounds. And today's panel will wrap up the 2024 series. So one housekeeping note, most of you are probably very familiar with Zoom by now. For this webinar format, we have the chat disabled, but we do have the Q&A active. So if you have comments or questions, please drop those in the Q&A at any time during the conversation, and we'll allow some time for audience questions at the end. We'll be drawing on those. Without further ado, I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Ken Menkhaus. Dr. Menkhaus is a professor of political science who has taught at Davidson for more than 30 years. His teaching focuses on international and comparative politics, as well as the nonprofit sector, and his regional specialization is on the politics of the Horn of Africa. Dr. Menkhaus is widely published and sought out. He's also humble. He asked me to scale back his bio, but you can go online and see the full array of engagements and service that he does related to his scholarship and research. But he's provided expert testimony on 5 occasions before congressional subcommittees, widely interviewed, consults for bodies such as the UN, the World Bank, the US government, and others. He's been awarded a Fulbright Scholarship, the U.S. Institute of Peace Grant, and is a senior fellow with the Rift Valley Institute. So Dr. Menkhaus, thanks very much for taking on this role, and I hand the mic to you to introduce today's panelists.
Thank you so much, Yancy, and welcome everyone. I've been asked to do a little scene setting first on the topic that we're about to explore, just to give some baseline information for those of you who may not be as familiar with climate change as others. Then I'll introduce our speakers and we'll get right to the Q&A. Over the past 50 years, the world has learned much about the long-term impact of greenhouse gas emissions. As evidence has mounted, concerns about global warming have gone from speculative and uncertain when I was an undergraduate to definitive and alarming. In 1992, the international community formed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed by 158 governments. That convention has provided the platform for annual international summits on climate change, producing multiple treaties and conventions designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the ultimate goal of slowing and halting global warming. Agreeing is one thing, implementing and enforcing agreements is another. This is a classic collective action problem in which all major polluters need to actually implement the agreement if we're going to get sustained improvement. In a landmark report just 2 years ago, the UN Secretary General described the history of climate accords as, quote, a litany of broken climate promises. Again, I quote, it is a file of shame cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track toward an unlivable world. That same UN report rang the alarm bell that time is not on our side. We are approaching a tipping point. An increase in global temperatures by 1.5 Celsius degrees will trigger irreversible climate change. Every year we delay worsens the problem. And if the world cannot find a way to eliminate or dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions soon, temperatures could rise 2 or even 3 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, with catastrophic impact on climate and the livability of much of the planet. This is the most urgent policy question of our time, and future generations are counting on us. To help us understand how the international community brokers and negotiates these conventions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're honored to have both Muna and Carmen with us today. Both attended the recent round of talks, the COP28 meeting held in December 2023 in Dubai. Quick bios for both. Ms. Jacqueline Musita, who goes by Muna, wears many hats. She's a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, not the first Davidson alum to be there, by the way, a senior climate finance advisor at USAID, and an international attorney specializing in business, human rights, and sustainability. She previously served in various leadership capacities at Rio Tinto, the Trade and Development Bank, and the World Trade Organization. She's a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy and sits on the board of the International Rescue Committee UK. Muna teaches currently at Georgetown University and the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. As a research associate at the China Law Development Project at Oxford University, her research focuses on Chinese companies' compliance with international law. She speaks and writes regularly on African business and geopolitical issues. She's published articles in the Financial Times, National Public Radio, CNBC Africa, and she's been interviewed by lots and lots of the top media sources, BBC, Newsweek, NPR. She's a term member also of the Council of Foreign Relations and a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. She's also a member of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation Leadership at the World Trade Organization. Again, she wears a lot of hats and has a unique perspective on this particular topic. Finally, she earned a JD from the University of Melbourne and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science at Davidson College and was a former student of mine I'm very proud of. Carmen Wagner, class of 21, is currently enrolled at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability and the Ford School of Public Policy on a dual environmental justice and policy track. Carmen has a keen interest in energy and climate policy and justice. She was selected as a member of the University of Michigan delegation to COP28. While at Davidson, Carmen earned a double major in economics and environmental studies while also playing women's soccer. She participated in the Sustainability Scholars Program, interning with Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, and later interned with the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. After graduation, Carmen will seek NGO work, a non-governmental organization, for those of you who don't know our jargon, to help the environment and create social change. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. I have a question for both of you. Muna, maybe you can start, but both of you, I hope, can answer this. Tell us a little bit about the nature of your work on climate change. And Muna, we're especially interested in some of the work on climate financing that you do at the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Thank you so much, Ken and Yancy, for putting this session together. It's really exciting to be back with all of you at Davidson and the wider Davidson community. I guess just to put climate finance, which is a portfolio I lead at USAID, into context, is we have a new climate strategy, new being 2022, which is one of the highlights of Samantha Power's leadership at USAID. And there are several pillars under the climate strategy. One, the one I lead, is to mobilize 150 billion in public and private finance by 2030. Another is to make 500 million people more resilient and adaptive to climate shocks. Another is to reduce or avoid 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. Another is to work with critical populations. So this is Indigenous people, youth, women, and the like in the countries we operate in. And the last one is to support 80 countries on, let's say, their climate policy. So that is helping them write their nationally determined contribution plans as well as their adaptation plans. Now, coming down into climate finance, my team does several things, including creating partnerships between USAID and both the private sector and public sector writ large. So we work across the interagency. So that could be working with the State Department, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the like. We create innovative financial instruments. So we use blended finance. So that's using USAID's grant money to put to a transaction that is meant to de-risk the transaction or bring in the private sector. We work on green bonds, blue bonds, gender bonds, whatever the case may be, as long as there is a nexus to climate. We also work on guarantees. Now, we come up with these instruments because a lot of our partner countries complain that it is very expensive to get climate finance. It takes too long. And because of the risk profiles of their countries and also the transactions they're in, it tends to be really difficult to access international climate finance. So a lot of our work is really to sit and think through how we can make it easier for the countries we work in. And just for context, we work in 90 developing and emerging markets around the world, ranging from countries as developed, I would say, as India, to countries like Ethiopia and Somalia. So it's kind of the full range. The last two areas that we work on are, utilizing USAID and US government's convening power. So kind of going back to COP28, really being thoughtful about the messaging that we're putting through the US government structures. And also using that as a means to negotiate formally through the COP process, but also as a means to engage behind the scenes and really get in buy-in from our partners on different aspects of climate. The last is mission support, and that's basically how our team works with the different country offices of USAID to mobilize money locally. Two last things that I'll say that are really important to our climate strategy are localization, really making sure that decisions aren't made here in Washington, D.C., but ultimately decisions are made on the ground in the countries we work in. So our budget is actually mostly in the countries of operation, and it really is those teams together with our foreign service nationals, which are people who are from the countries we operate in, really co-creating with development partners locally kind of the best way forward for their own development. And then the last is really kind of around inclusion, how we make sure we're being thoughtful and making sure that we do apply principles of equity within our work. I'll go ahead and stop there and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Muna. Carmen, tell us a little bit about the nature of your work on climate change.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Yancey and Ken, for having us. And it's nice to be back at Davidson. It's been only a few years for me, but I do miss it. And I'm wearing the colors. So so I've done, since my time at Davidson, I've done kind of a pretty wide variety of climate change related work, primarily at the university, as well as with a couple of jobs I've had. But I worked on climate adaptation in the Pacific with the UN through a master's project at the School for Environment and Sustainability. We kind of worked primarily in Samoa and Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands to help provide recommendations to increase access to accessing, disseminating, and utilizing climate information services in the Pacific. That was a really big project. We interviewed a bunch of on-ground partners, and worked with a couple of different UN agencies as well as more regional agencies in the Pacific. And I'll go into that a little bit later as well. And then outside of this climate adaptation work, I've done a few different projects related to energy efficiency and renewable energy. So I worked at the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance in Atlanta, as well as the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy on both state and local policies and programs related to energy efficiency and energy justice. So thinking of how weatherization programs to ensure that how people can receive more funding to weatherize their homes in case of extreme weather events, and just simply very cold or very hot weather. And at COP, I attended some events on the work of energy efficiency, both in the US and elsewhere, as both a climate adaptation and a mitigation unifier. And this was primarily focused on giving people a higher quality of life, both within the US and outside. And then more recently, I've had a couple projects, both within classes, and they've kind of transferred into research projects on the side that looked at renewable energy policies. So looking at public service commissions within the US, as well as climate policies such as renewable portfolio standards at the state level, both focused in Michigan and Georgia. I'm from Georgia originally, which is why my interest kind of went there for one of my classes. But right now I'm working on a project actually looking at how to deploy clean and equitable energy in Michigan. And there's a lot of really cool climate work going on in Michigan right now, so it's a cool place to be. But yeah, that's pretty much the gist of my work as it has to do with climate change, but I'll probably expand more on it later.
All right, thank you so much. Turning back to Muna, can you explain for our participants just what exactly the COP or COP is? What role does it play in the development of international climate action?
I actually thought your preview was great to start with. So I think just to add maybe a little color of kind of where we are within the USG context. Even though we tend to focus on the 2 weeks at the end of every year as kind of being COP, I think it's important to note that it is an ongoing process. As soon as people get home from the COP, they rest for those 2 weeks. And by January 1st, we're back to really thinking through across the interagency what our priorities are as USG and how to best communicate that through the negotiation process through the year. State Department leads on negotiations, and then they tap different technical experts from across different departments to really advise on different areas of the negotiation. So for instance, from USAID last time at COP28 in Dubai, we had a representative from our adaptation department to really advise on the global adaptation goal. We had another person from our forestry department really thinking through aspects of forestry. I think another part that is really important is to understand that it is everyone from around the world bringing in their not only positions formally, but also their experiences. And so we have a situation where members from small island developing states, least developed countries, and countries that are severely affected by the negative impacts of climate change come in with one agenda that is sometimes different from the agenda that more developed countries come to the conversation with. So it does get kind of sticky and hairy and quite emotional, because you do have countries, for instance, in the Pacific that are saying our islands are sinking and we're not doing enough. So yes, we can focus simply on GHG emissions, but in reality, adaptation is our concern. What are we thinking about the future of migration for climate refugees, for instance, for islands that are sunk, or people who are no longer able to live in the locations where they were born? So bringing to bear all of these sensitivities politically, but also very personal. Everyone kind of, brings their negotiation teams together to think through and come up with specific targets. I think we might be talking later about some of the targets from COP28, but I think the last thing that I'll say is some of the complaints about COP28 in particular was that the Emiratis tried to bring too many people to the conversation. There were well over 100,000 people signed up, even though the conference facility was excellent and could fit a lot of people. The reality was it was very hard to really get to the heart of the conversation just because the conversation was so dispersed. Another part, I think that in particular, Dubai got a lot of criticism for was this was the second time COP was being held in a oil producing country. Egypt was COP27, and now COP28. So the question was really, are we really going to get to our outcomes if we have a country that is in essence conflicted? They tried to push back on that, and one solution they found was really to come up with new financial solutions to really demonstrate, their willingness. So they created a $30 billion, for instance, climate fund, which is the largest climate fund around. That budget is even larger than the Green Climate Fund, which is a product of the UNFCCC. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's fund. So it's interesting moving into this year, COP29, which will be in Azerbaijan, the third oil producing country in a row to host the conversations, whether we will kind of focus on additional outcomes or whether we'll use it as an opportunity really to push the fossil fuel industry to do more. So I'll stop there.
Well, Muna, thank you so much for clarifying the part about the nature of negotiations, that they're not just held on site for a 2-week period, but that they're in fact, more or less continuous. This is what some analysts call the bicycle approach to negotiations on free trade or climate or arms control, is that you got to keep going. You can never stop, but you want the momentum to be gone. Could I ask a quick follow-up on that? In the work that you do between COP meetings, is what percentage of energy is devoted to negotiating with other countries, and what percentage is fighting rearguard battles and negotiating with domestic constituencies in the U.S.?
It's a continuous process of both. It's kind of like, how do you stand on a seesaw and remain, and not fall off. In the US in particular at this time, I think it's an ongoing process. I think we've had the great privilege of having Secretary Kerry as our climate envoy, and I think he did a great job of communicating the US's desires and intentions to be a serious climate player, but also balancing the interests of Congress and the pushback that we've been getting internally. We're looking forward to John Podesta in the role and really seeing how we can continue to balance that. But let's just say in the background, there is no dull moment. Climate is definitely a top priority of this administration, but there is kind of the need to move from administration priorities on the one hand to really pushing through Congress to get the money we need to actually do what the administration is asking us to do. So it's an ongoing, it's an ongoing song and dance.
Thank you, Muna. Carmen, I imagine some of our undergraduates who are participating are highly jealous of the fact that a graduate from the year 2021 has already made it to a COP summit. How were you chosen to attend the meeting, and what roles did you play?
Yeah, so I was chosen to attend as a University of Michigan delegate. So the university sends about, I think this year we had 16, but it depends on the year how many passes we get to get into the conference. But this year we had 16 students attend, and we were split between the 2 weeks. So people were able to attend either the first week or the second week. I went the first week. And they are chosen from a number of different programs within the university. So we had people from the business school, a lot of people from public policy and the School for Environment. We also had some nuclear engineers, which was cool. And then I think we also had like a PhD student on like geophysics. And so it's a very like interdisciplinary group, which is really cool. So people are able to kind of go look at their interests while at COP and kind of bring that information back to the school. But in terms of the process, I had to apply. There was an application process, and then was chosen by the faculty advisor based on like interest in international climate change and policy and involvement in climate issues on campus. And I'm also a board member of the Climate Blue organization at university, which works to kind of spread information on international climate policy and COP28. And the board also works with the delegates every year to kind of make the process as seamless as possible, which is not always easy. But the main goal of us basically going to COP as a university delegation was to learn as much as possible related to our interests and both interests that like Climate Blue members had, or say our programs had. We would like talk to people before going and be like, what are you interested in? And see if it like aligns with certain delegates. So that was kind of cool. And then we would basically come back to the university, spread that information and education on the conference and climate change policy. We all wrote blogs when we first got back on sort of our interests and our experience. And then like later today, I have another panel where me and 5 other delegates will be speaking to the School for Public Policy, and we'll hopefully have events at almost all the schools that people are represented to try to like bring in a number of different perspectives. But at the conference itself, I was an observer. So there's parties, which come from the countries themselves and do a lot of the negotiations and more work at the conference itself. And then there's observers who pretty much go observe the negotiations. They're from a number of NGOs, businesses, industry, etc. There's a lot of different universities. There's a lot of different observers. But we were under the RINGO constituency, which is Research and Independent Non-Governmental Organizations. So they basically give out the passes to a certain number of people, and that's one of the bigger constituencies. And there's also like environmental NGOs, and then like business and industry NGOs. One that might be of particular interest to Davidson students is Youngo, which is it's like comprised of youth activists focused on climate change. We had someone actually in the School for Environment that went as a part of Youngo in his undergraduate during his time at undergrad. I think there's like an application process, but it's like YOUNGO, so that might be a good opportunity for students at Davidson. And I wish I had known about it sooner. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it.
Carmen, a quick follow-up. You said that you and many others who are coming from institutes of higher education were observers, but you also just made reference to an activist group. Were some of the observers also engaged in activism, or was that was a condition of participation not to be an activist there?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on at the conference all at once. So there's obviously the negotiations going on, but then separately, there's a number of side events. I think they're put on by the UN. They basically set like different panelists to talk about different topics related to the negotiations going on. I know one I went to had like a number of academics. There's a number of like people from local governments just talking about how they are working to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And yeah, there are activists. There's these things called pavilions. So there's country pavilions going on, which basically country representatives put on like they have like a little room where they're able to share information on their country and hold a bunch of different events. And those are really cool. There was like a US pavilion I went to a couple events at, and then there's a wide range of topics as well. And then there's other pavilions which are put on by other observer organizations typically. So I know there was an Indigenous rights one. There was a number of like businesses that had their own. There was some where people would come together. So there was one like World Wildlife Fund had an energy efficiency talk there. And it was like America's All In, but it was like really cool topics. But they would basically just put on events like all day, every day. And
so it sounds like it wasn't just observing; it was also networking and coalition building and a little. That's great to know.
Yeah, exactly.
Muna, this question is huge and expansive. We could spend hours on it. We don't have hours, unfortunately. Could you just briefly summarize what were the key issues at this particular meeting, and what were the key outcomes and announcements?
Ooh, big question. So I'll highlight just a few. Starting with the global stocktake. This was really kind of the first time we, the international community, were really looking to understand our progress towards everything we've done around climate change. I think the sad reality is we came up, after going through kind of all the research, we came up with the results that, we are off track. And I think, unfortunately, as we continue to experience more extreme weather, be it heat, flooding, it just kind of brings home the reality of the research and our experience. I think another aspect, besides kind of us not getting to the 1.5, I was really encouraged by over 200 countries really pledging to move away from fossil fuels. I think we're starting to see a slow movement that'll hopefully move us to a different way of living, right? From my perspective, I think one that I was watching closely was kind of the climate finance conversation. Yes, there's always a need for more, but I think we kind of, from an OECD perspective, we're really excited about the fact that we had finally reached the 100 billion that we committed to. And it's been years of, developing countries really pushing to say, you, the developed world, made this mess and you're not paying for it. And so I think by demonstrating through the 100 billion that we have achieved that, there was a very strong talking point. That talking point, however, was sometimes dimmed by the fact that there was a push for the loss and damage fund. The US position on the loss and damage fund initially was that we did not support it in the iteration that it was proposed. We eventually did support the loss and damage fund, including contributing 17 million to that. But I think that the challenge there, as always, is, the push that we need to do more. The US argument, at least on that, is we are doing a lot, even though it may not be couched under the auspices of the loss and damage fund and the framing of basically blame of the developed world. The global goal and adaptation was another one that I think kind of getting us closer to what we actually mean is I think meaningful. And at least kind of setting a target for 400 million. I think the challenge, though, is the adaptation needs are so large. And yes, 400 million is a target, but on an annual basis, we're looking at needs between 200 and like 400 million. So the numbers are kind of mind-boggling. I think what brought us a lot of pride, I think, as USG, was really announcing the following. Under our Prepare initiative, which is the president's initiative around resilience and adaptation, we managed to get corporate pledges of worth 2.6 billion. There was also a lot of excitement around the global methane pledge and really the US really committing to do more. From a USAID perspective, we had a blended finance transaction between USAID, Spec Carey's office, and the Danish of a 1.4 billion transaction focused on the energy transition. And so there were some really good kind of climate finance nuggets and commitments to actually investing across mitigation and adaptation in developing countries that I think, were kind of got drowned because of everything going on, but there were some very strong outcomes.
In the interest of time, I'd like to follow up with just you, Muna, so we can get to all of the questions. I'll turn right back to you, Carmen, for the next question. And that is, you've already alluded to this, and that is a big part of climate action is mitigation efforts to slow and stop emissions. But another part of climate action is preparing countries to be as resilient and adaptable as possible for inevitable changes that are going to occur in the near future. We all know that fragile and conflict-affected states and poor states are often located in zones that are likely to be hardest hit by climate change. So how is USAID and the global community trying to help those societies adapt and build resilience? And I can just say, as someone who works in the development field, one thing that's been really noticeable for me is how the framing of development in terms of resilience and adaptability to climate change has just come to dominate what we talk about now.
No, I think we're doing a lot, but definitely not enough. So earlier I mentioned our target, being 150 billion, and a majority of that is mitigation. It is really how are we going to reduce GHG, mostly through energy systems. So from an adaptation perspective, Administrator Power has really pushed us to think more creatively. One way is through Prepare, which is really led by the White House. But other initiatives that we're working on are, for instance, an adaptation window where we're working very closely with the Danish governments to really support innovations and investment in insurance, and in particular parametric insurance. How do we use predictive capabilities to really help, especially smallholder farmers, to better plan? And the other is around water management. And so that goes from water management systems to water infrastructure, and trying to prevent loss and increase effectiveness. Another way is climate information services. We're doing a lot of work with our colleagues at NASA, but also our colleagues with State Department. Once again, really trying to use technology, and in particular predictive technology, just to better understand before crises hit and to better prepare. The other is, I would say, from a food security perspective, is we are working very closely with NORAD on a food security initiative and really kind of coming up with solutions to regenerative agriculture. The last that I'll say from a higher policy level is we are working with the Green Climate Fund, as well as with the Task Force on Access to Climate Finance, which was one of the initiatives of COP26 in Glasgow, to really think through how institutions like the Green Climate Fund can be more creative and adaptive and flexible to supporting fragile and conflict affected states. And so in that capacity, we're coming up with blended structures where we're putting money into those countries, but also working with countries like Somalia on their NDCs and NAPs to make sure that they actually have the legal frameworks in order to be able to receive that money and have better absorptive capacity when that money comes into those countries. So lots of balls there, but also just understanding it's so hard to work in those countries. So when you add kind of the complexities of climate and migration, we're in a very tough position, and one that we need to figure out really, really soon.
Thank you. Thank you. You made that complexity very clear. Carmen, a question for you. Worldwide energy systems have driven a major increase in fossil fuel production over the last 5 decades. These fossil fuel-based systems both accelerate global climate change and overburden certain communities who live near these productions with adverse health and local environmental impacts. Could you talk about how work at COP28 focused on the need for renewable energy and sought to make energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable more equitable?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess one of the biggest outcomes that people point to is that while this isn't what many countries were hoping for, I think it was the first ever pledge to phase out fossil fuels at this year's COP28 as part of the global stocktake. And many did call for like a complete phase out, and that was a hope that coming into COP. Especially I was there the first week, which was a lot more I think more hopeful than probably the second week from what I heard from the other delegates. And so this was what all the countries could agree to. And in the UN process, I think every single country or party has to agree in order for anything to kind of become part of the language. So that's a big stepping stone. And then one thing, it's not legally binding or really officially part of their agenda or the COP agenda, but there was the first couple of days, I think over 118 countries signed on to support for the tripling of renewables and energy efficiency. This was a pledge to reach 11,000 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And this would take into consideration different starting points of countries and also national circumstances of, say, developed or developing countries to reach these goals. And then last, I would say, was the just energy transition was a major focus of COP28. There was a whole day theme of just transition. So that refers to having workers and communities not be left behind in the clean energy transition. This could include fossil fuel workers as well as communities that typically live in these areas and have maybe benefited from taxes or et cetera. But negotiations went on to create the Just Transition Program Work Plan, which focused on outlining just transition pathways for countries, which will vary probably depending on the dependence on fossil fuels. So it's probably the first step for countries to considering and acting on social impacts and opportunities arising from the clean energy transition. And this would be included in the climate action plans of those countries. Although there was definitely some disagreement in negotiations over the timelines and priorities of different countries, but that's to be expected.
Thank you so much. Muna, climate change is increasingly viewed through a security lens. It has the potential to create or worsen resource wars and produce destabilizing large-scale migration. How did COP28 participants propose to balance security and development goals in addressing climate change?
I think one, actually having a day focused on kind of recognizing that fragility needs a separate conversation, I think was great. So from our perspective, we managed to have our conflict and prevention team, we managed to have our Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs, and other donors kind of came with similar teams to really zero in and highlight the complexity of those situations. I think another part that was, I would say, great, at least as far as conversation, was I thought that there were some really good appeals from some of the country partners that we work with, and very good specificity, because a lot of times we get requests which are too broad and blanketed that it's really hard to move on them, but really kind of starting to say, we see an opportunity for change within the multilateral development bank frameworks, and this is why and where we see the need for change. So for instance, if we are hit by a climate disaster, we would like a pause in the repayment of our loans. So that allowed donors, especially those who are contributors to the World Bank, to say, okay, how do we factor that into our decision-making process? So I think just coming to greater clarity on a lot of the needs was good. I think where we haven't found agreement yet is what the future of, can I say, the legal framework around international refugee law looks like. At the moment, if you are a refugee, you do have rights accorded to you when you do cross a border. And that's usually based on, persecution, conflict, and the like. At the moment, if you are a climate refugee moving from your home to another country, there's really, really no way of getting protection. And we just haven't seen any move on that conversation. I haven't yet tracked as to where that will land within the COP conversations, but it's definitely a conversation that we are looking at strongly as USG, not only looking at kind of conflict affected areas, but also just kind of looking south of the border and understanding some of the challenges that our countries in our neighborhood are facing with respect to climate. And so yeah, I think it loops back to the need for more adaptation funding and really being more conscious about adaptation as we structure development programs.
Thanks. This question is to either one of you. It's a question that we all get, those of us who are in the policy world. Students who say, I want to do what you do. How do I get engaged in work on, in this case, climate change? Any guidance or advice about different paths?
I can talk, although I still have some work to do to get into the field, but there are a lot of organizations and people all over the world working to address climate change right now. I mean, this is actually, I know it's scary, but also a very like exciting time for climate change work. So just getting involved in any way you can, like advocacy, policy, research, there's so many different avenues. It's also a very interdisciplinary problem, as shown by like the University of Michigan delegate is very interdisciplinary with people from all sorts of fields. So really, no matter what your work or interest is, you can work to address climate change. And also there's important work at like almost every level. So local, state, national, international, there's really a lot of impact that can be done at each of those levels.
Yeah, I think just to jump in, one, tap into the Davidson network. There are a lot of people doing interesting work at the nexus of climate. So reach out. I think most people are always kind of happy to have conversations with you. And if you're sitting there kind of going, I really don't know what I want to do with my life, I think that there are a lot more options now than definitely in 2003 when I graduated. Another thing I will appeal to all of you based on where I'm sitting now. Definitely consider government. There are great internship opportunities across the federal government. And so welcome to DC. And I think it would just be great to understand how USG works within the climate context. But besides that, I mean, NGOs are a great starting point, but also don't be afraid of the corporate sector and kind of being change agents, especially in kind of the harder to abate sectors. I worked in mining and I thought it was a great platform to really try and shift ideas from within an institution and really kind of bring everyone kind of the wider sensitivities and helping them understand why it was important to look at different aspects of not only the environment, but also social issues that we were dealing with, at least within the mining sector. So there are lots of avenues, and it's okay to change over time. I came to this way through having practiced law and having gone into consulting and mining. So I think there are different ways of really kind of making your footprint visible within the climate space.
Thank you both. And if I could just reinforce the message, make full use of the Davidson network. The Davidson Alumni Network is incredibly supportive and tight in this particular field of broadly international development and diplomacy. We often refer to the Davidson Mafia. Everyone seems to know everyone and looks out for everyone. So students do take full advantage of that. Yancy, I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't see any audience questions yet, but if I could prompt the audience, any questions for our panelists?
Yes, please do bring those questions in, and while you're thinking of those and getting those typed into the chat, I wanted to just understand, while we have a few minutes, from both of you, what I'm sure every day was a little different, but how did you plan a day, and what was the food? I love food. What did you eat, and what was it like kind of moving around throughout the physical space and prioritizing in a venue with, I think you said 100,000 folks? How did you navigate that?
So I'll start. It was the first conference I went to where I did not sit for long. There was a lot of walking. I started my day at 5:30. By 6:30 was heading to the conference venue because I didn't want to get stuck in the really long winding line. The conference venue was great in that there was lots of space, but it was terrible for food. It was really hard to get food, and also bad for water. And so we brought a lot of granola bars with us as a delegation, and we would kind of stay at the conference venue till about 6, 7, and there were a lot of after sessions, so lots of cocktails and meetups with different partners. And so I really wasn't getting back to my hotel until 11. And so I got sick when I got back, and most of at least the USAID delegation as well, was pretty much out of commission for the week after COP because it was literally 14, 15, 16-hour days.
Yeah, I would say very similar things. It started very early in the morning, would try to get there pretty early. I think so in terms of like preparation for what events we're going to and stuff like that, that happened usually night before or morning of, because a lot of the things going on didn't get posted until either of those times, usually day of sometimes. So yeah, the way we were staying like kind of far away, so we would have to like Uber to the metro and then take the metro to the thing, and they did give us free metro passes, which was really nice, and a water bottle. So that was good. But it was very like, here's what we're doing for the day, and then it would change completely the minute we got to the conference. And I would say yes, also very long days. There would be after events both at the conference and after the conference, but there was events going honestly till like 9:30 some days. But very long days. Food also being unable to, or hard to access, and also not very good. So that was the tough part. And expensive for me as a grad student. So, but it was a cool experience overall.
I think just to add, for me, it was also great. We did end up having a Davidson meetup. And so ended up, yeah, I'm like, I wish I knew you were there, Carmen, but we did end up meeting with some of the alumni who live in Dubai. So that was nice to also see people and their families. Yeah.
I guess that included Sean.
Sean Brooks,
Yeah,
Amrota
yeah.
Abdella,
Amrota,
Jessica
yeah.
Davis. Yes.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
All former students of mine. In fact, Amrota and Sean, just for my current students, they met in my class and got married. So be real careful about courses you choose with me, because, you know, it can have longer term implications.
And just to add to that, my husband and I actually met at Sean and Amrota's wedding. So,
Oh, also, do I get credit for that?
yes, so you can add that too.
All right. It's like a hockey assist. I don't see any other questions. Do we have a question in, Yancy? Yancy, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks for bearing with us as we navigate this tech. Yeah, I'll share this question that came in from the audience. What is the best place to see a summary of the U.S. COP commitments and our progress toward reaching them?
I will put in chat at least the commitments that the State Department drew up. And so the State Department kind of collected all of the USG commitments. Tracking them, I think, will be another challenge, to be honest. I think you will see progress throughout the course of the year. I also think, since it is an election year, there will be a weaving of kind of our successes abroad and kind of bringing that to the domestic agenda as well. I did put in chat kind of a link to the US Pavilion, just so you could get an idea of what types of meetings and events were taking place there. But I'll add more within chat.
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much to add to that. I also have difficulty finding some of these resources. The UN website is a little confusing in terms of finding documents and everything. But yeah, I think that's probably a good place to start.
Okay, one more question for me, and then if anyone wants to add, we have time, I think, for one more audience question after that. Can you all weigh in on whether you have personal thoughts or you heard from others about the tension that sometimes exists between the carbon emissions that are generated from bringing people together to talk about climate change issues? This is something I face in my field as well as a challenge. Do you have thoughts on that balance?
If it were my choice, I would actually say meet once every 2 years. I think every year is a lot of money, a lot of emissions, kind of everything. And I think that now, especially post-COVID, we're already doing so much online that I think it's great. Like, there's a great opportunity to at least continue that momentum and engage, with wider communities and audiences. Obviously, that's not my choice. But from at least a USAID perspective, we did almost like Carmen, but we did have, say, an application nomination process where we did cut down the size of the delegation. So there were only 21 people from USAID. but you have 21 from one government institution, you know, with multiple institutions. I think labor had 3 people, and I was like, that's kind of the right size for a delegation. But I think it is a challenge. We as USG do have emissions targets. Before any of us travel, we do have to kind of go through a questionnaire to make sure it is essential travel. So we're not just kind of roaming all around the world at will. But I think once it does get to the point where there is anything contentious, I think we tend to kind of put more people. So if you'd remember, a lot of the criticism towards the end of the year was President Biden isn't going, which basically triggered Vice President Harris to go last minute, which Vice President Harris, as an individual, plus her entourage, is pretty big entourage. So I think a lot is also reactive based on what our partners think is important, that also demonstrates our commitment to the cause.
Yeah, I think I agree with pretty much everything. I think the one thing I would add is it is really, I think, somewhat helpful to be in a place where people can talk face to face. I think there is a lot that can get done in that forum, but yeah, it's a hard dilemma because I think this year's COP was the largest ever. So that was another thing that probably increased the travel emissions. I'd be interested to see data on that. I don't know if that exists, but would be interesting.
Well, if I could, on behalf of all of us at Davidson College, thank you both, Muna and Carmen, for spending time with us to talk about your work, to give advice to the students. I want to thank you also just for the good work you're doing on such a critically important topic. And if I could add to all of you participants who also are engaged in varying ways on this topic, thank you for the good work that you're doing on this. Yancy, thank you for organizing it. And I hope we can all get together again, either via Zoom or maybe with a little bit of a carbon footprint in Dubai or Nairobi somewhere at some point. But thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.